Hi, it's Gary. Welcome to today's video. Today, I thought we'd talk about the wind. And yes, I'll pause while we get all the snickers out of the way. Anyway, the wind, it's something that we've all got to experience with. All you've got to do is step outside the house and chances are you're going to feel it, whether it's just a small breeze or a raging storm. But what causes the wind? And to be honest, why is the wind important to us? Well, the wind, very simply, it can be called the movement of air with respect to the Earth's surface. Now, there are other winds as well. There's solar winds, there may be winds on other planets, but we're looking here at the Earth. What causes the air to move? Well, again, this is a really simple thing. It's caused by differences in temperature in the atmosphere. It's mostly due to the way that the sun heats various parts of the Earth's surface. Land, it absorbs and releases heat faster than water. So during the day, when the sun's providing heat, the land, it becomes hotter than water. The warmer land, it heats the air above it. And this causes the air to become less dense, and then it rises. So that means that we've got a lower pressure over the land. And the lower pressure, the reason it rises, well, that's mainly due to convection. Cooler and drier air from high pressure areas can then move in to fill the space that's left behind by this low pressure. And it's this movement of air, that's what we call wind. At night, water, it cools slower than the land. So the air above the land cools, meaning that the low pressure, it's now above the water. So the wind, it then blows from the land out to water. And as we've said, this is the cause of wind. Now, there are larger systems at work as well, but they're all still driven by the sun. If we look at the equator, that's the band around the widest part of the planet. That gets more solar energy than the poles do. This means that the equator, it's warmer than the poles. So the air in it, that's heated and it rises. This air then flows up into the atmosphere and it starts to move towards the poles. As it does, the air cools and then it returns to Earth somewhere about the subtropics. The cooler area, it then flows back towards a low pressure area which is around the equator. We get a similar effect at the poles where there's not as much solar warming, so the polar winds form, and with the pole being colder, that's where we get the air moving away from the pole. Other impacts on the wind, well, they can be down to things called topology. That's the shape and the makeup of the land. And even buildings can affect the wind. So when we're designing urban areas, it's important that we take into account how the buildings are going to look, how they're going to affect the flow of the wind. Talking of topology, what I'd like you to do is just think about two mountains. And between two mountains, we've got a pass. That pass is narrow, so as the wind comes in, it hits the pass and it goes through. But because it's narrow, it funnels the wind through, and that increases the speed. The wind then goes through, comes out the other side, but it's still going at that higher speed, and it can blow harder for many miles beyond the pass. In hills and valleys, you also get friction between the land and the wind, and this affects the way that the wind behaves. It causes small differences in pressure, and that affects the direction that the wind is blowing in. The shape of valleys, well, that's part of the topology. That also impacts the wind. As the wind comes through, it might be hitting the sides of the valley, it might be hitting large rocks or stands of trees. When it does, the wind hits them and it gets deflected, so it moves onto a slightly different path. And again, that affects the way the wind is blowing. If we take a closer look at the wind direction, it reveals another effect which is called Coriolis effect. This effect is driven by the shape and also the spin of the Earth. At the equator, which we've already said is the widest part of the planet, at any point it's moving at roughly 1600 kilometers per hour or 1000 miles per hour. If we go to the poles though, that's the narrowest part, and a point there, it will be moving at 0.00008 kilometers an hour, or 0.00005 miles per hour. And yes, that's a 0 followed by 4 zeros, then the 5. That works out roughly 2 meters per second. The result of the speed difference means that the winds, they tend to curve towards the right in the northern hemisphere and then towards the left in the southern. As we've already said, friction, that impacts the direction of the wind. Friction, it's the force that resists movement over various surfaces. And what this results in is the wind gets bent. So friction, it's higher over land than it is over water. So it's affected by the shape of the land, it's affected by the shore, and it's similar to the impact of mountains, hills and valleys. It bends and impacts that wind direction. The higher the friction, well, that increases the amount of bending that the wind experiences. The strength of the wind, that's also driven by how close the high and low pressure areas are. This is what's called a pressure gradient. It's essentially how quickly the pressure is changing. If the low and high areas are close together, then the gradient, that's steeper, and the winds, they blow stronger. A combination of different temperatures, pressures, temperature gradient, and the topology, they all directly affect the strength of the wind. So now we know a little bit about how the wind works. But why is it so important? Well, a lot of plants, they use the wind to dispense their seeds. So without wind, we wouldn't get widespread plant life. As we've already said, the planet, it heats more at the equator than it does at the poles. Without the wind, there'd be no movement of air between the two. That would mean that areas around the equator, they would be so hot that they couldn't support life. And the areas around the poles, well, they'd be even colder than they are now. With the equators and poles being at these more extreme temperatures, it also affects the ocean currents because they're driven by this temperature gradient as well. And these ocean currents, they transport nutrients throughout the ocean. So it's going to also impact the various life forms that are in the oceans and the seas. The wind, it drives rain patterns. The wind blows clouds from over water to over land and fetches with it rain. This is a natural form of irrigation for crops. Without the wind, the clouds wouldn't be pushed inland. That means the coastal areas, they'll get all the rain, they'll be waterlogged. But it also means that the inland areas won't get any rain. They'll become deserts. Now, the big impact for that, it's going to reduce the amount of land that can support farming and, to be honest, all human activities. Yes, we can use artificial irrigation. That becomes more important because it's what we'll then need to water crops, provide drinking water and water for sanitation. But it would be a massive engineering challenge. The result? Well, we get a lower amount of agriculture. That will lead to famines. Now, there is some good news. Without the winds, without the way this temperature difference works, well, we'd have no hurricanes or cyclones. So that means the damage caused by those wouldn't occur. But when we look at the downsides, they far outweigh that. And this all shows just how important the wind is to life on Earth. Without it, the planet, well, it would be just totally alien to us. And I've got to be honest, very likely there'd be no life at all. So next time you go outside and you feel the wind on your face, just think how simple the mechanism is that drives the wind, but how much your life depends on it. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. It's been a fun one to research this week. What are your thoughts about the winds? Have you got any nice stories you can share? I love to get people's stories about how things are impacting them. Please drop a comment down below. Let's kickstart the conversation. Please hit the thumbs up button. Every time you like, every time you comment, just helps with the YouTube algorithm. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel so that you can get new videos as I release them. I'll talk to you again soon.